hall was filled with noise and movement. People in uniforms and polished shoes walking briskly, their voices echoing against the tall walls. But when the general entered, few even noticed. He stepped in with a calm dignity that needed no announcement. His uniform pressed so neatly that every line seemed to tell its own story, and the medals on his chest glimmered faintly under the lights, quiet proof of battles fought and sacrifices endured. To most in the room, he was just another man in uniform, someone blending into the crowd, and to some, he was judged by nothing more than the color of his skin, dismissed without thought or respect. No one knew the years he had given away on foreign soil, the nights he had stayed awake protecting men who never even remembered his name, or the choices that had scarred his heart but strengthened his spirit. He carried all of this in the straightness of his back, in the steady pace of his footsteps, and in the calm way his eyes scanned the room. There was something about him, a weight that hovered in the air when he passed, though most ignored it, too distracted to see that greatness often arrives without noise. The general's silence was not weakness, but restraint, the kind that comes only from those who have seen more than words can hold. As he walked further inside, conversations slowed for reasons people could not explain, though none turned to greet him. A few curious eyes followed him, narrowing as if trying to place his face, wondering if they should recognize him, but their hesitation betrayed the truth. They did not know who he was. And yet, somewhere deep within the ordinary air of the hall, something unsettling began to stir, a tension that whispered that this man was not meant to be ignored. He did not hurry, nor did he seek to claim attention, but every step he took seemed to carry the weight of a history invisible to those around him. He was an outsider in a room filled with uniforms, and still, he moved as if he belonged to the very heart of it. There was a quiet suspense rising with him, like a story about to unfold, and though no one could see it yet, the hall was about to witness something that would silence even the boldest voice. The general had barely taken a few steps deeper into the hall when two officers, standing by the side, exchanged a glance, their eyes narrowing as if measuring his worth with nothing more than a passing look. They did not see the polished medals on his chest, or the steady calm in his posture. Instead, they saw only what their minds wanted to believe. To them, he did not belong. Their whispers were sharp and hushed, but their expressions betrayed their judgment, carrying the kind of suspicion born not from reason but from assumption. Without pausing to question or to ask, they let their doubt harden into certainty. One of them stepped forward with a rigid jaw, his hand already reaching for the cuffs, while the other followed close behind, their boots clicking too loudly against the polished floor. The general stood still, watching them approach, his face unreadable, his silence both calm and unnerving. The room, still filled with voices and footsteps, had yet to notice what was about to happen. In a single, thoughtless moment, the officers acted, cold metal wrapped around the general's wrists, the sound of the shackles snapping shut cutting through the air like a blade. He did not resist, did not fight back, but the quiet dignity in his stillness seemed to mock their haste. Some nearby turned their heads, puzzled, and whispers began to ripple through the room as eyes fell on the scene. How could a man in such a uniform be treated this way? Why had they shackled someone who carried himself with such authority? But the officers, blind to the growing unease around them, pressed on with stiff movements, their judgment clouded by their own certainty. The general's gaze lowered slightly to the cuffs, not in anger, but in quiet disbelief at how quickly respect could be stripped away by ignorance. His silence was louder than any protest could have been, and the longer he stood there, bound by chains that should never have touched him, the heavier the weight of suspense grew in the room. People who had barely noticed his arrival were now frozen in place, staring, their conversations fading into stunned quiet. The officers thought they had controlled the situation, but in truth, they had only set the stage for a reckoning. What they believed was strength was nothing more than a mistake that would soon unravel before the very eyes of everyone present. The shackles clinked faintly as the general shifted his hands, the sound echoing louder than it should have, a chilling reminder that even the most honorable could be misjudged in a heartbeat. The sound of the shackles locking seemed to echo far longer than it should have, and in that heavy moment, the hall fell into an uneasy hush before a wave of gasps broke through the silence. Heads turned sharply, eyes wide with disbelief, as the sight of the shackled general spread like a spark through dry wood. Some froze where they stood, their breath caught in their throats, while others leaned closer to one another, whispering quickly as though trying to make sense of what they were seeing. A few opened their mouths, as if to speak out, but no words came, for the weight of the scene pressed too heavily upon them. How could such a man, dressed in a uniform that carried the history of battles fought and sacrifices made, be bound like a criminal? Yet the general himself remained unmoved, his shoulders squared, his chin steady, his silence cutting sharper than any shouted protest could have. It was a silence that unsettled the room more than anger ever would, for it carried with it the unspoken reminder of all the years he had endured, of the discipline carved into him through hardship and command. The officers, who had acted without thought, suddenly found themselves the center of every gaze, their confidence faltering under the collective weight of judgment now aimed at them. The crowd's murmurs swelled, a tide of disbelief, threatening to spill into open outrage, but still, no one stepped forward, their hesitation born from fear of consequence, of protocol, of stepping out of line in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, every second of the general's silence seemed to speak, louder and louder, reminding them all that what they were witnessing was not just a mistake, but a wound cut into the dignity of a man who deserved more than this treatment. The air itself seemed to thicken, heavy with shame and suspense, as the room shifted from confusion to realization. Each person who looked on knew deep down they would remember this moment, not because of the chains or the whispers, but because of the way the general stood unbroken, unbowed, his silence more commanding than any rank pinned on his chest. The officers tightened their grip on him as though trying to regain control, but their movements only revealed their uncertainty. In that vast hall, filled with whispers, gasps, and pounding hearts, the loudest thing of all was the quiet dignity of the man they had wronged. It was a silence that demanded reflection, that pierced the conscience of every onlooker, and that left the air trembling with the weight of what would come next. The hall seemed to hold its breath as the general stood shackled, his wrists bound by cold steel that clashed against the honor sewn into his uniform. Around him, the crowd shifted uneasily, their eyes unable to look away, though many wished they could. Some lowered their heads in shame, unable to bear the sight of such disrespect, while others whispered nervously, caught between confusion and disbelief. Yet through it all, the general stood with the same calm composure he had carried into battles, the same quiet strength that had steadied men in times of chaos. His eyes did not plead, his posture did not break, and in that stillness, something began to stir among the onlookers. Those who dared to meet his gaze found no anger, no bitterness, only an unshakable dignity that seemed to reflect their own unease back at them. The silence that wrapped around him was not weakness but power, a reminder that true strength does not always roar. It was this calmness, this refusal to bow under humiliation, that began to command respect, even from those who had doubted him moments before. Every second felt stretched, the sound of shuffling feet and hushed voices filling the space like a drumbeat of suspense. The officers who had shackled him avoided the eyes of the crowd, their confidence slipping as they realized that the weight of judgment was no longer on him, but on them. Still, the general did not move, did not speak. His silence became the center of the room, and all waiting eyes turned toward him, as if expecting something more. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part, that he did not need to defend himself, for the truth of who he was, of what he had endured, was already written across his calm face and steady stance. The crowd, once restless with confusion, now stood in quiet awe, each person grappling with their own reflection of shame or respect, knowing they were witnessing something they would not forget. The waiting eyes lingered, searching for meaning in his silence. And in that long, tense moment, the general's calm dignity spoke louder than any words ever could. The heavy doors of the hall creaked open, and a hush fell over the crowd as the defense secretary stepped inside, his presence commanding attention before he had spoken a single word. His steps were firm, steady, carrying the weight of authority and years of service, and his eyes immediately swept across the room, sharp and searching. The whispers stilled, replaced by the faint sound of boots against polished floor, each step echoing louder than the last in the tense silence. He paused only for a moment at the threshold, taking in the sight of uneasy faces, nervous officers, and the unmistakable tension that seemed to hang thick in the air. Then his gaze landed on the shackled figure at the center of it all, and everything changed. Recognition came in an instant, striking him not just as knowledge, but as something deeper, like an ache in the chest when a truth you never expected to see stands before you. His eyes narrowed, not in doubt but in disbelief, as though he could not comprehend why the man before him, his metals glinting faintly, his posture still straight, despite the chains, was bound like a criminal. The secretary knew that face, not from briefings or second-hand reports, but from history itself. This was no ordinary man, no nameless visitor in the wrong place. This was a soldier whose name had been etched into honor rolls, whose courage had carried men through fire, whose loyalty to the nation had been tested more times than anyone could count. The crowd watched as realization flickered across the secretary's features, their own unease deepening as the weight of his recognition hung heavy in the room. He did not rush forward, but his expression spoke louder than words, a mix of shock, anger, and respect colliding all at once. The officers who had shackled the general shifted nervously, the color draining from their faces as the truth dawned on them. The secretary's presence alone seemed to strip away their false authority, exposing the gravity of their mistake to everyone watching. Still, the general did not move, his silence unbroken, his dignity intact, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. The crowd held its breath, knowing that whatever came next would change the room forever. The entrance of the defense secretary was no longer just the arrival of a leader. It was the turning point, the moment when recognition shattered ignorance and the weight of respect threatened to silence every careless word, every mocking whisper, every unjust act that had come before. In that instant, the hall no longer belonged to the officers or even to the murmuring crowd, belonged to the unshackled truth of who the general was, revealed through the eyes of the one man whose acknowledgement carried the power to change everything. Without a moment's pause, the defense secretary's hand rose to his forehead in a sharp, flawless salute, the movement so swift and decisive that it cut through the thick tension in the hall like a blade. For a heartbeat, no one breathed, no one moved. The silence was not just quiet, but heavy, as though the very air had been pulled still by the weight of that single gesture. It was not a casual act, not a polite nod of acknowledgement, but the kind of salute reserved only for the greatest of leaders, the kind that carried with it the respect of a nation and the recognition of sacrifice. The crowd froze, their eyes wide, their hearts racing, as they watched the most powerful man in the room bow his head slightly before the one who stood in chains. Every whisper died instantly, every mocking thought swallowed, and the walls themselves seemed to hold their breath, trembling with the force of unspoken realization. The general did not move, his face steady, his eyes calm, but the faintest glimmer of something deeper flickered across his expression, not pride, not triumph, but a quiet acknowledgement that dignity cannot be broken, not even by shackles. Those who had laughed before lowered their gazes, the shame of their ignorance pressing harder than any reprimand could. The officers who had bound him stood stiff, their hands twitching nervously at their sides, as though they wished they could undo what had been done. But the gesture of the salute made clear that nothing they could do now would erase their mistake. The salute was more than respect, it was a judgment, a declaration to everyone in the hall that they had failed to recognize greatness when it stood before them. The silence deepened, stretching into seconds that felt like an eternity, each one pressing down harder until it became impossible to ignore the truth. This man in chains was not an outsider, not a stranger, but a hero who had carried the weight of service, and the defense secretary's hand at his brow told the world that no rank, no title, and no prejudice could diminish that truth. In that single moment, the power shifted entirely from the guards who thought they held control, to the general who had said nothing yet commanded everything, and to the secretary whose salute carved a line between arrogance and honor. The room was no longer a place of whispers and doubt. It had become a place of reckoning, where silence itself bowed to the dignity of one man and the respect shown by another. Every head in the room turned toward the shackled man, and in the silence that followed the salute, the truth spread through the crowd without a single word being spoken. The medals on his chest, once overlooked, now seemed to shine brighter under the lights, each one a testament to years of sacrifice and battles fought not for himself, but for the very people who had dared to doubt him. The weight of realization pressed down on everyone present, and hearts that had been quick to judge now beat with unease, each pulse carrying the sting of guilt. Whispers had no place. Now only silence remained, heavy and unrelenting, as the image of the defense secretary's salute echoed in their minds. They saw not just a man in uniform, but a decorated hero, a leader whose honor and service demanded respect that should never have been questioned. The officers who had bound his wrists stood frozen, their faces pale, their eyes darting toward the floor as if to escape the unbearable truth of what they had done. Their arrogance had blinded them, and their actions now felt like chains not on his wrists, but on their own hearts, shackled by shame. The crowd shifted uneasily, some biting their lips, some lowering their heads, each one silently asking themselves how they could have failed to see what was before them. The general had spoken no words, yet his calm silence was louder than any accusation, more piercing than any outburst. His dignity, untouched by humiliation, made the shame of others grow heavier by the second. It was not just about the mistake of two officers. It was about the failure of everyone in the room who had chosen to watch, whisper, or assume instead of truly seeing. The defense secretary's salute had pulled away the veil, exposing the truth in its raw form, and now there was no way back, no way to undo what had been revealed. The officers' hands twitched as though they longed to unfasten the chains, but they knew it was too late. The damage was done. Their misjudgment laid bare for all to see. The realization settled deep into the hall. This was no ordinary man, no outsider to be doubted or mocked, but a leader who had already given more for his country than anyone could measure. And in that moment, the shame was theirs alone, while he, even in chains, stood taller than them all. The general did not let anger shape his response, nor did he allow bitterness to leave his lips. Instead, he stood tall, his wrists still bound, and returned the defense secretary's salute with a calm nod that carried more strength than any raised voice could have. The crowd, holding its breath, expected him to condemn, to lash out at the humiliation he had endured, yet he chose silence, and in that silence lay a lesson more profound than any lecture. His quiet grace spread through the hall like a slow tide, pulling at the hearts of those who had misjudged him, leaving them unsettled, yet awakened. The shackles, once symbols of insult, now appeared powerless, almost irrelevant against the towering dignity of the man who wore them without complaint. That night, when the event was retold beyond the walls of the hall, people did not focus on the shame of the officers or the whispers of the crowd. They spoke instead of the general's composure, his refusal to let disrespect drag him down, and the salute that turned the moment from humiliation into honor. It became a story of dignity that could not be taken away, of respect that could not be denied, and of the reminder that true greatness does not demand recognition, reveals itself when tested. For some, the image of the shackled hero would haunt their conscience, a reminder of their own failure to stand up when it mattered. For others, it became a source of inspiration, proof that silence, when carried with strength, could speak louder than thunder. And so, the lesson remained, whispered in homes, echoed in barracks, retold in offices and gatherings. Power without humility crumbles, but humility, even when wronged, rises unbroken. The general had said nothing, yet his grace had taught more than words ever could.